January 17, 1940, Wilhelmshaven Naval Base, North Sea coast. The smell of diesel fuel and salt water hung thick in the air as Captain Lieutenant Werner Hartmann descended the conning tower ladder into U-47's cramped interior. The metal rungs were slick with condensation, each step echoing in the cylindrical chamber that would become home for the next 8 weeks. Outside, grey waves crashed against the harbor's concrete breakwaters, and seagulls circled the massive concrete U-boat bunkers that stretched along the shoreline, like cathedral arches built for warfare. Hartmann's boots touched the deck plates with a familiar clang, and he breathed in the peculiar mixture of machine oil, human sweat, and the metallic temps of recycled air that every U-boatman knew intimately. This was the beginning of another patrol, another hunt in the Atlantic, another chapter in what Gross Admiral Karl Dönitz had promised would be Germany's stranglehold on Britain's maritime lifeline. The confidence aboard U-47 that winter morning was palpable, infectious, bordered on certainty. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. Sink merchant ships faster than the British could replace them, and the island nation would starve into submission within months. The German Naval High Command had calculated everything with Teutonic precision. Each U-boat could sink approximately 60,000 tons of Allied shipping per patrol, with 30 operational boats in rotation, maintaining constant pressure across the Atlantic convoy routes. They would destroy merchant vessels at a rate that no shipyard on Earth could match. The British merchant fleet, vast as it was, represented a finite resource, and resources could be depleted through systematic attrition. Admiral Dönitz had presented these figures to Hitler himself, spreading charts and graphs across the conference table at the Reich Chancellery, his finger tracing the projected decline of British tonnage with the steady confidence of a mathematician proving a theorem. Mein Führer, Dönitz, had declared in November 1939, "If we maintain 300 U-boats in operational rotation, Britain cannot survive beyond 18 months. Their shipyards are already working at maximum capacity, and they are losing vessels at twice the rate they can construct replacements." Hitler had nodded approvingly, his eyes gleaming with the prospect of bringing England to its knees without the massive land invasion that had haunted German strategic planning since the war began. What neither Dönitz nor Hartmann nor any man in the Kriegsmarine could have imagined that cold January morning was that across the Atlantic, in a nation still technically neutral, an industrial transformation was about to begin that would render their careful calculations obsolete. They could not have known that American shipyards, which had built a mere 2 ocean-going merchant ships in 1939, would soon be producing vessels at a rate that defied not just German expectations, but the entire historical precedent of maritime construction. They could not have conceived that the same industrial capacity that had once transformed Henry Ford's assembly line would soon be applied to shipbuilding with such revolutionary effect that the entire strategic equation of the Atlantic War would invert. The Germans expected attrition. What they got was abundance on a scale that turned the mathematics of naval warfare into absurdity. The Battle of the Atlantic began with Britain's declaration of war in September 1939. But its true character emerged slowly, like a pattern becoming visible only when viewed from sufficient distance. For the first months of the war, U-boat operations were constrained by international law, or rather by Germany's desire to maintain the fiction of restraint. U-boat commanders were ordered to surface, inspect merchant vessels, allow crews to evacuate, and only then sink the ships with gunfire or scuttling charges. This gentlemanly warfare lasted exactly until the realities of modern naval combat made it suicidal. British merchant ships began carrying deck guns. Ships disguised as harmless freighters concealed naval crews and hidden weapons, and the Admiralty ordered merchant captains to radio U-boat sightings immediately, turning every civilian vessel into a military asset. The rules of engagement collapsed within weeks. An unrestricted submarine warfare became the de facto policy of both sides. By October 1939, the numbers from that first year of war seemed to validate every German assumption about the campaign's trajectory. In September 1939, U-boats sank 41 Allied merchant ships totaling 153,879 tons. October brought 54 ships and 186,910 tons to the bottom. November, 33 ships, 108,608 tons. The tonnage graphs in Berlin's naval intelligence offices showed a steady upward trajectory, each month's figures exceeding the last. each patrol report bringing news of convoys scattered and merchant hulls torn open by torpedoes. The British were hemorrhaging shipping capacity at precisely the rate Dönitz had predicted, and British shipyards, working around the clock, were managing to replace only a fraction of the losses. The mathematics of starvation were playing out exactly as calculated. A German staff officer, writing in his private diary in December 1939, expressed what many in the Kriegsmarine believed. The English have courage, but courage cannot build ships fast enough. By next Christmas, London will be suing for peace terms. What the Germans understood about shipbuilding came from a traditional European perspective, shaped by centuries of maritime construction that had changed incrementally rather than revolutionarily. Building a ship was a craft, requiring skilled workers who understood wood and steel, riveters who could seal hull plates with precision, carpenters who could construct the 1,000 wooden components that went into every vessel, welders who could work with the heavy metals that formed a ship's skeleton. A typical British merchant ship required 12 to 18 months to construct from keel laying to launch, employed hundreds of specialized tradesmen, and represented the accumulated expertise of generations of maritime tradition. The shipyards at Belfast, Glasgow, Newcastle, and Liverpool were working at maximum capacity. But maximum capacity meant, perhaps, 12 to 15 new hulls per month across the entire British Empire. This was respectable production, representing centuries of refined technique and organization. But it paled against the rate at which U-boats could destroy shipping. The equation seemed immutable. Ships took months to build, but only minutes to sink. Across the Atlantic, in the autumn of 1939, most Americans watched the European war with wary distance. The Neutrality Acts remained in force. Isolationist sentiment dominated congressional debate, and the memory of the First World War's casualties created powerful resistance to any involvement in what many saw as another round of European tribal warfare. But Franklin Roosevelt, reading the intelligence reports from London and Paris, understood what isolation could not protect America from. If Britain fell, the entire Atlantic Ocean would become a German lake, and German military power, freed from European constraints, could threaten the Western Hemisphere itself. The question was not whether America's interests aligned with Britain's survival, but how to aid Britain without triggering the political backlash that direct military involvement would create. The answer, Roosevelt decided, would be industrial rather than military. America would become what he would later call the arsenal of democracy, supplying Britain with the weapons and ships and supplies needed to continue fighting without initially committing American soldiers to the battlefield. The problem was that American shipbuilding capacity in 1939 was laughably inadequate for such an ambition. The Great Depression had devastated the maritime industry, along with every other sector of the economy. Shipyards had closed, skilled workers had dispersed to other trades or unemployment lines, and the few yards that remained operational were building small coastal vessels, rather than the ocean-going freighters that Britain desperately needed. The entire American merchant marine fleet had been declining for decades, unable to compete with lower foreign wages and more modern international vessels. In 1937, Congress had passed the Merchant Marine Act, attempting to revive the industry through subsidies and incentives. But by 1939, the results were minimal. When British purchasing agents arrived in America seeking ships, they found a maritime industrial base that was only marginally more robust than what existed in their own exhausted nation. But America possessed something that Britain and Germany both lacked: vast reserves of industrial capacity that were underutilized, waiting for demand that could justify their activation. The same factories that had built automobiles at unprecedented rates during the 1920s sat half-idle during the Depression. The same steel mills that had once forged the infrastructure of American industrialization were operating at 40% capacity. The same workers who had perfected assembly line production techniques in Detroit and Pittsburgh and Cleveland were underemployed, their skills preserved but unused. What America lacked was not industrial potential but industrial motivation, not capacity but purpose. The war would provide that purpose, and American industry, once fully mobilized, would demonstrate productive capabilities that would have seemed like fantasy to planners trained in European eye. The British Ministry of War Transport commissioned studies to design an emergency freighter that could be built quickly using simplified construction techniques. The result was a basic, unglamorous vessel based on a tramp steamer design from the 1870s. a simple reciprocating steam engine, rather than modern turbines, a single propeller, a boxy hull that prioritized cargo capacity over speed or grace, and all-welded construction that eliminated the thousands of rivets traditional ships required. The design was deliberately archaic in many respects, but archaism served a purpose. Older, simpler technology meant that less skilled workers could build the ships, that components could be standardized and mass-produced, that construction time could be compressed from months to weeks. The first ocean-class ship was built in England, but British shipyards, already operating beyond capacity and vulnerable to German bombing, could not produce enough vessels to offset the mounting losses. Roosevelt administration identified an obscure clause in the Neutrality Act that allowed American shipyards to build vessels for foreign governments as long as those vessels were not explicitly military. In December 1940, the British Purchasing Commission signed contracts with American shipbuilding companies to produce 60 ocean-class freighters, later designated the Liberty ship design, using modified British plans adapted for American construction standards. The man chosen to coordinate this unprecedented shipbuilding program was Henry J. Kaiser, an industrialist who had made his fortune building dams and bridges but had never constructed a ship in his life. This apparent disadvantage would prove to be Kaiser's greatest asset. Unburdened by traditional maritime thinking, Kaiser approached shipbuilding the way he had approached dam construction, as an engineering problem to be solved through standardization, prefabrication, and the systematic application of mass production principles. Kaiser studied the Liberty ship design and immediately recognized that traditional shipbuilding methods were obsolete. Shipyards typically constructed vessels sequentially, building the keel, then the whole framework, then the plates, with each stage requiring the completion of the previous stage before work could proceed. This was craftsmanship, but craftsmanship was slow. Kaiser proposed building ships the way Ford built automobiles, by breaking the vessel into prefabricated sections that could be manufactured simultaneously in different locations, then assembled like a three-dimensional puzzle on the slipway. Hull sections, deck sections, bow and stern assemblies, engine rooms complete with machinery, all could be built in separate workshops by different crews working in parallel, then brought together and welded into a complete ship in a matter of days. The idea was heretical to traditional shipbuilders, who insisted that every vessel was unique and required the careful judgment of experienced craftsmen. Kaiser ignored them and began building the shipyards that would prove them wrong. The first Liberty ship keel was laid at the Bethlehem shipyard in Baltimore on April 30, 1941. America was still officially neutral, but neutrality was becoming increasingly fictional as Roosevelt navigated the narrow space between isolation and belligerence. The Liberty ships were being built for Britain under the Lend-Lease program, which allowed America to transfer military and industrial supplies to Allied nations while postponing payment until after the war. It was a legal fiction that satisfied isolationist sensibilities while enabling material support, and the Liberty ships represented its most visible manifestation. The first vessel, christened SS Patrick Henry, after the Revolutionary War orator who had proclaimed, "Give me liberty or give me death," was launched on September 27, 1941, exactly 150 days after her keel was laid. For a traditional shipyard, this would have been impressive. For the revolution in shipbuilding that was about to unfold, it was merely the beginning. Werner Hartmann, returning from his third Atlantic patrol in June 1941, noticed nothing different in the strategic equation. His patrol had been devastatingly successful. 7 merchant ships sunk, totaling 41,000 tons, with only 11 torpedoes expended. The convoy he had stalked across 3 nights of North Atlantic darkness had scattered in panic. Escorts unable to prevent his approach, merchant captains unable to maneuver their lumbering vessels away from his torpedoes' calculated tracks. The celebration in Loyang Harbor when U-47 returned, flying 7 pennants to represent 7 kills, confirmed what every U-boat man already believed. They were winning the tonnage war, sinking ships faster than the British could replace them, slowly strangling the island nation that Churchill defended with rhetoric but could not feed with speeches. The possibility that American shipyards might alter this equation seemed remote, almost laughable. America had built exactly 2 Liberty ships by the time Hartmann returned from patrol. 2 ships could not change the mathematics of a campaign. That was destroying 50 to 60 ships every month. But the mathematics were about to change in ways that would have seemed impossible to anyone thinking within the traditional framework of shipbuilding as a craft rather than an industry. Kaiser and the other shipyard operators contracted to build Liberty ships were not merely constructing vessels faster than traditional methods allowed. They were creating an entirely new industrial system that treated shipbuilding as a problem of organization and logistics rather than seamanship and tradition. At Kaiser's Richmond shipyard in California, workers who had never seen an ocean were learning to weld hull plates in enormous warehouses far from the waterfront. Prefabricated sections arrived at the shipways on specially designed rail cars, lifted by gigantic cranes into position with tolerances measured in millimeters. The assembly process resembled nothing so much as building with enormous steel Lego blocks, each component manufactured to precise specifications that ensured it would fit perfectly with its neighbors when the final assembly began. The statistics from those first months of Liberty ship production revealed a learning curve that was almost vertical in its ascent. The first Liberty ship required 150 days to build. By November 1941, Kaiser's Richmond shipyard was completing vessels in 90 days. By February 1942, construction time had dropped to 60 days. By May 1942, some shipyards were launching Liberty ships 40 days after laying the keel. The improvement was not merely incremental. It represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of industrial production, applying principles that had revolutionized automobile manufacturing to an industry that had resisted such innovations for centuries. Each ship completed taught lessons that were immediately incorporated into the next vessel's construction. Bottlenecks in welding were solved by hiring and training more welders. Delays in component delivery were eliminated by bringing suppliers into the shipyards themselves. Traditional craft expertise was systematically captured, standardized, and taught to workers who had previously been housewives, farmers, or unemployed laborers. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and Germany's subsequent declaration of war on the United States 4 days later, transformed the Liberty ship program from an aid project into a national survival imperative. Within weeks, the Roosevelt administration had established the War Production Board, with sweeping powers to convert civilian industry to military production. Steel that had been going to automobiles was redirected to ships and tanks and aircraft. Factories that had manufactured refrigerators began producing ammunition, and shipyard capacity, already expanding rapidly under British contracts, exploded into a national mobilization that would eventually employ more than 1 million workers in 18 major shipyards and hundreds of smaller facilities. The scale was unprecedented. The organization was revolutionary, and the results would prove decisive. German naval intelligence began receiving puzzling reports in early 1942 about American shipbuilding capacity that seemed too fantastic to be credible. An intelligence summary from March 1942, preserved in Berlin's Naval Archives, notes with evident skepticism, American sources claim Liberty ship production may reach 3 vessels per week by year's end. This represents either gross propaganda or a fundamental misunderstanding of maritime construction requirements. No nation has ever sustained such production rates, and the necessary skilled labor force simply does not exist in the United States. The assumption underlying this dismissal was perfectly reasonable within the framework of traditional shipbuilding. You could not build ships without shipbuilders, and training shipbuilders required years of apprenticeship and accumulated experience. What the Germans failed to grasp was that Kaiser and his fellow industrialists were not training traditional shipbuilders. They were training industrial workers to assemble prefabricated components using techniques that eliminated much of the skilled labor that traditional construction required. By the summer of 1942, Liberty ship production had achieved rates that seemed to validate the German intelligence officers' skepticism, except the numbers were real, not propaganda. In June 1942, American shipyards completed 26 Liberty ships. In July, 31 ships. In August, 34 ships. The tonnage being launched each month now exceeded the tonnage being sunk by the entire U-boat fleet, even as the U-boats were experiencing what they would later call the happy time, when Allied convoy defenses were still ineffective and U-boat wolfpacks could attack with near impunity. For every merchant ship sunk in the Atlantic, American shipyards were now launching 2 replacement vessels. The attrition mathematics that had seemed so compelling in 1940 were in. The resource that U-boats were supposed to deplete was instead multiplying. growing faster than the Germans could destroy it, expanding beyond any capacity the Kriegsmarine possessed to control. The symbolic moment that would crystallize American shipbuilding's revolutionary achievement came in November 1942. At Kaiser's Richmond shipyard, Henry Kaiser, always conscious of publicity's value, had announced that his workers would attempt to build a Liberty ship in less than a week as a demonstration of American industrial might and a morale boost for shipyard workers nationwide. The vessel chosen was SS Robert E. Peary, named for the Arctic explorer, and the construction began on November 8, 1942. What followed was industrial theater on a grand scale, with Kaiser orchestrating shifts, materials, and workers with the precision of a conductor leading a symphony. Prefabricated sections arrived on schedule from feeder plants across California. Welders worked in triple shifts, the shipways lit by arc lights through the night. Crane operators moved components with balletic precision, positioning 10-10 sections within millimeters of their designated locations. The assembly was not merely fast but elegant, a demonstration that mass production need not sacrifice quality, that speed and precision could coexist when planning and organization were sufficient. For days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes after the keel was laid, SS Robert E. Peary slid down the shipway into San Francisco Bay, complete and ready for sea trials. The time would have seemed impossible to any shipbuilder trained in traditional methods, but there she was, a 7,200-ton freighter built faster than a medieval craftsman could have constructed a rowing boat. The newsreel cameras captured the moment for posterity, the champagne bottle shattering against the bow, the vessels gathering momentum down the greased slipway, the enormous splash as she entered the water, and behind her, the workers cheering, many of them women who 18 months earlier had never held a welding torch or operated a crane. The record would never be broken. It was not meant to be repeated as standard practice, but to demonstrate what was possible when industrial capacity was fully mobilized and properly organized. For German U-boat commanders, the autumn of 1942 brought the first intimations that something fundamental had shifted in the Atlantic's strategic equation. The convoys they attacked now seemed infinite in number, and the merchant ships they sank were replaced faster than intelligence reports could track the replacements. Werner Hartmann, on his 7th patrol, sank for freighters in a single night attack on convoy SC-107, expending his full complement of torpedoes in what should have been a triumphant slaughter. But when U-47 returned to Brest in December 1942, Hartmann learned that SC-107 had been carrying Liberty ships built within the past 2 months, vessels whose sinking made virtually no impact on Allied shipping capacity because they had already been replaced by newer vessels even before they were torpedoed. The futility was beginning to penetrate even the most confident U-boat crews. You could not win a war of attrition against an enemy whose losses were irrelevant to their overall strength. The Liberty ship became, in a sense, the physical embodiment of American industrial democracy translated into naval warfare. Each ship was identical to every other ship, standardized to the point of interchangeability, built by workers who were themselves interchangeable, trained quickly to perform specific tasks rather than master entire crafts. This was antithetical to German military philosophy, which emphasized elite units, specialized training, and the cultivation of individual expertise. The U-boat service represented the cream of the Kriegsmarine, its commanders carefully selected, its crews intensively trained, each boat a precision instrument crewed by men who understood their vessel intimately. The Liberty ships were the opposite, crude, simple, slow, built by novices, crewed by merchant sailors with minimal training, valued not for their individual qualities, but for their numbers. Yet in total war, quantity proved to be its own quality, and abundance overwhelmed excellence through sheer mass. By 1943, the Liberty ship program had achieved full industrial maturity. 18 major shipyards were producing vessels simultaneously, each yard launching ships from multiple slipways, the entire system coordinated through the U.S. Maritime Commission with an efficiency that would have been impossible before modern communications and management techniques. In January 1943, American shipyards completed 47 Liberty ships. In February, 53 ships. In March, 63 ships. The production rate had reached 3 ships per day, exactly the number that German intelligence had dismissed as propaganda 12 months earlier. The tonnage being launched was now triple the tonnage being sunk, and the gap was widening every month as production accelerated and improved. Anti-submarine tactics began reducing effectiveness. The impact on the Battle of the Atlantic was decisive and increasingly obvious to both sides. In April 1943, the Allies lost 56 merchant ships to U-boat attack, totaling 327,943 tons, a significant loss by any standard except that American shipyards launched 92 Liberty ships that same month, adding 644,000 tons of new shipping capacity. The arithmetic was brutal and inescapable. The U-boats were losing the tonnage war by a ratio of 2 to 1, and the ratio was worsening monthly as American production continued to accelerate, while U-boat losses mounted under increasingly effective Allied countermeasures. May 1943 marked the turning point when units confronted with unsustainable U-boat casualties and diminishing returns, temporarily withdrew the Wolfpacks from the North Atlantic. The withdrawal was presented as a tactical repositioning, but every officer in the Kriegsmarine understood its true meaning. Germany had lost the Atlantic campaign, defeated not by superior seamanship or tactical brilliance, but by industrial capacity that had simply overwhelmed her ability to destroy it. The Liberty ships themselves were far from perfect vessels. They were slow, making only 11 knots under ideal conditions, easy targets for U-boats that could approach their convoys with relative confidence. They were uncomfortable, their crew quarters cramped and poorly ventilated, their all-welded construction making them vulnerable to catastrophic structural failure in cold northern waters, where brittle fracture could split a hull in minutes. They leaked, they vibrated, they broke down with frustrating regularity, and experienced merchant sailors called them sea cows, and worse epithets that reflected both affection and exasperation. But they floated, they carried cargo, and most importantly, they existed in numbers that made individual losses strategically irrelevant. When a Liberty ship was torpedoed, another Liberty ship was already sliding down a shipway in California, or Maine, or Oregon, ready to replace it, before the sinking vessel's crew had been rescued from their lifeboats. The human dimension of Liberty. Ship production represented its own revolution, particularly in the transformation of the American workforce that war mobilization created. The famous Rosie the Riveter propaganda image, depicting a strong woman in work clothes with a rivet gun and the slogan "We can do it," was based on actual shipyard workers like Rosina Bonavita, who set a record by driving 3,345 rivets in a single 6-hour shift at the Eastern Aircraft Plant. But riveting was only one of dozens of skilled trades that women mastered in shipyards across America, welding being the most critical and most dangerous. Welder Nona Poole, working at Kaiser's Richmond shipyard, recalled decades later, "They told us it would take 6 months to learn welding properly. We learned it in 6 weeks because the ships couldn't wait. We were terrified at first, working 70 feet above the ground on scaffolding inside a hull section, but after a while it became automatic. You stopped thinking about the danger and just focused on making the next weld perfect." African Americans, excluded from many industries by formal and informal segregation, found opportunities in shipyards that had previously been denied them. Though those opportunities came with their own complications and confrontations, the Kaiser shipyards were among the first to hire black workers in significant numbers, not from progressive ideology but from practical necessity. The labor requirements were simply too vast to be met by white workers alone. The integration was tense and sometimes violent, with white workers occasionally refusing to work alongside black colleagues, but the pressure of production schedules and federal oversight gradually broke down barriers that had seemed immutable only years before. By 1944, African Americans constituted nearly 10% of shipyard workers nationwide, working as welders, crane operators, electricians, and every other trade necessary to ship construction. The Liberty ships that resulted from this unprecedented labor mobilization carried more than cargo. They carried the accumulated labor of a nation transformed by total war into an industrial colossus. Each vessel represented approximately 250,000 man-hours of work, employed materials from 46 states, incorporated components manufactured by thousands of suppliers, and sailed with cargo loaded by longshoremen who were themselves part of the vast logistics network that sustained Allied military operations on 3 continents. The ships were anonymous, their individual names forgotten almost immediately after launch, but collectively they formed an armada that dwarfed every navy in history. By the war's end, 2,710 Liberty ships had been launched, an average of more than 2 ships per day for 3 straight years, representing more tonnage than the entire British merchant fleet that had existed in 1939. German recognition of their strategic defeat in the Atlantic came gradually, filtered through layers of propaganda and self-deception that made acknowledging the truth almost impossible. Admiral Dönitz continued to insist through 1943 and 1944 that the U-boat campaign remained effective, that new technologies like the snorkel breathing apparatus and Type 21 submarines would restore German advantages. That persistence would eventually overcome the material imbalance. But the frontline commanders knew better. A U-boat officer, writing in his private journal in August 1943, expressed what many felt but few would say publicly. We are no longer hunters but hunted, no longer wolves but lambs sent to slaughter. The ocean that was once our domain has become our grave, and we fill it one boat at a time while the American ships multiply beyond counting. We were told that will and courage could overcome material advantage. We are learning that this is a lie that dead men tell to comfort the living. The last significant U-boat offensive came in early 1945, a desperate operation that achieved nothing except additional casualties among crews that Germany could not replace. By then, Liberty ships were crossing the Atlantic in convoys that numbered 50 or more vessels, protected by escort carriers and destroyer groups that made submarine attacks suicidal. The U-boats that remained operational were reduced to hiding, waiting, occasionally attempting attacks that were more gestures of defiance than militarily meaningful operations. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a mopping-up operation, the outcome determined not in 1945 but in 1943, when American industrial production had reached levels that made German victory mathematically impossible regardless of tactical skill or strategic genius. The symbolic power of the Liberty ship extended beyond its military function to represent a broader ideological confrontation between industrial systems. Nazi Germany had organized its war economy around the concept of selective excellence, producing superior weapons in limited quantities, relying on quality to overcome numerical disadvantages, trusting that German engineering and German fighting spirit would prevail over the merely material advantages of their enemies. This approach had worked brilliantly in the war's early years, when superior German tanks and aircraft and training had overwhelmed Polish, French, and Soviet forces that outnumbered them significantly. But it failed catastrophically when confronted with an American industrial system that refused to accept the trade-off between quality and quantity, that instead insisted on producing vast quantities of adequately good equipment rather than limited quantities of excellent equipment. The Liberty ship embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was not the best freighter ever designed. That distinction belonged to faster, more efficient vessels that traditional shipyards produced in small numbers. But the Liberty ship was good enough for its purpose, and it existed in numbers that made excellence irrelevant. A U-boat commander might take pride in sinking a Liberty ship efficiently, using only one torpedo where a less skilled commander might waste 2. But that efficiency achieved nothing when American shipyards were launching replacement vessels faster than torpedoes could sink them. Excellence in destruction could not overcome adequacy in production when production occurred at revolutionary scale. The post-war fate of the Liberty ships themselves reflected their essential character as emergency vessels built for immediate need rather than long-term service. Many were sold for scrap within years of the war's end, their usefulness exhausted, their simplified construction making them uneconomical for peacetime commerce. Others were transferred to foreign nations as part of reconstruction aid, forming the foundation of post-war merchant fleets for Greece, Norway, Italy, and dozens of other countries. Some were converted to other purposes: barracks, ships, storage hulks, floating grain elevators. A handful survived into the 21st century, preserved as museum ships or maintained by maritime heritage organizations, physical reminders of an era when industrial capacity had proven decisive in determining global conflict's outcome. But the Liberty ship's legacy extended far beyond the vessels themselves. The shipbuilding techniques pioneered in their construction revolutionized post-war maritime industries worldwide. Welding replaced riveting as the standard construction method. Prefabrication became routine in shipyards across the globe. The organizational principles that Kaiser and others had developed, just-in-time delivery of components, parallel construction of sections, Systematic training of semi-skilled workers became standard practice, not just in shipbuilding but in construction industries generally. The idea that complex industrial products could be mass-produced using interchangeable components and simplified designs became fundamental to post-war economic development, influencing everything from housing construction to electronics manufacturing. The human legacy was equally profound. The men and women who had built Liberty ships carried their experience into post-war civilian life, bringing with them attitudes and expectations about work, capability, and possibility that had been transformed by their wartime experience. Women who had welded hull plates returned to find that traditional domestic roles felt constraining after years of industrial employment. African Americans who had worked as skilled tradesmen in integrated, however reluctantly, shipyards were less willing to accept segregation's limitations in civilian life. The GI Bill, providing education and housing benefits to returning veterans, was complemented by similar opportunities for civilian war workers, creating a massive expansion of the middle class and educational opportunity that would define American society for generations. For Germany, the lesson of the Liberty ships was incorporated into post-war strategic thinking about the impossibility of conventional military victory against superpowers with continental scale industrial capacity. The Cold War doctrine of mutually assured destruction through nuclear weapons reflected, in part, a recognition that industrial attrition warfare, of the type that had decided the Atlantic campaign, would inevitably favor nations with greater population and productive capacity. Nuclear weapons offered smaller powers the possibility of deterrence, without requiring industrial parity, a strategic revolution that made the tonnage mathematics of the Atlantic campaign obsolete for future conflicts. Werner Hartmann survived the war, surrendering aboard U-47 in May 1945 when fuel exhaustion made further operations impossible. In post-war interviews, he reflected on the moment when he realized that the Battle of the Atlantic was lost. It was not a single event, but a gradual recognition that no matter how many ships we sank, there were always more ships. We would attack a convoy, sink half a dozen vessels, and the next convoy would be larger than the one we had just attacked. It was like fighting the tide. You could succeed tactically, sink every target you aimed at, and still be losing strategically, because the ocean was filling with ships faster than we could empty it. We were drowning in American abundance. That phrase, drowning in American abundance, captured something essential about the Liberty ships' meaning in the larger war. The vessels themselves were unremarkable, even crude, but their sheer number transformed them into a force that could not be countered through traditional military means. Each Liberty ship represented approximately $2 million in $1,943, a trivial sum by American standards, economically insignificant in a national budget that was spending nearly $100 billion annually on war production. The Germans sank hundreds of them, expending precious torpedoes and irreplaceable submarines and skilled crews to destroy assets that Americans replaced almost casually, launching new vessels before the old ones had finished sinking. The mathematical imbalance was so extreme that it approached absurdity. Germany was spending invaluable resources to destroy things that America considered disposable. The symbolic object that recurs throughout the Liberty ship's story is not the ships themselves, but the welder's torch. That hissing flame that fused steel plates into hull sections, that transformed raw materials into vessels, that represented the fundamental industrial process by which American abundance manifested itself physically. The torch was wielded by housewives and farmers, by teenagers and grandmothers, by people who had never imagined themselves as industrial workers, but who learned the skill in weeks and applied it with sufficient competence that their welds held against Atlantic storms and torpedo explosions. The democratization of industrial skill that the welding torch represented was as revolutionary as the ships it produced. Excellence was not abandoned but redefined. Excellence became the ability to teach skills broadly rather than hoard them carefully, to produce adequately rather than perfectly, to value quantity as its own form of quality when quantity reached revolutionary scale. In the final accounting, the Liberty ships sank more U-boats than any weapon system the Allies deployed. Not directly, Liberty ships carried no weapons beyond defensive deck guns, but through the strategic inversion they created, every Liberty ship launched forced Germany to expend additional submarines, additional torpedoes, additional skilled crews to maintain even the fiction of an effective blockade. As Liberty ship production accelerated, U-boat losses mounted proportionally, not because individual U-boats became less effective, but because effective attrition required more submarines attacking more targets more frequently, exposing themselves to Allied countermeasures more often. The mathematics that had seemed to promise German victory in 1940 became the mathematics of German defeat by 1943, and the Liberty ships were the variable that had inverted the equation. The German expectation that U-boats could starve Britain into submission rested on reasonable assumptions about industrial capacity, construction timelines, and the immutable nature of shipbuilding as a craft requiring years of training and centuries of accumulated expertise. What the Germans never expected, what no one expected, was that an American industrialist who had never built a ship would revolutionize maritime construction by ignoring traditional methods and applying mass principles developed in completely different industries. The Liberty ships proved that tradition could be obsolete, that expertise could be taught rather than cultivated, that quantity could overwhelm quality when produced at sufficient scale, and that industrial capacity, properly mobilized and intelligently organized, could be as decisive as any weapon system in determining military outcomes. The poetic truth that emerges from the Liberty ship story is that freedom's abundance will always defeat tyranny's efficiency in conflicts of sufficient duration and scale. The authoritarian efficiency that Nazi Germany prided itself on, the ability to mobilize resources quickly, to direct labor without negotiation, to prioritize military production without democratic debates, initially superior to the messy, contentious, slow-to-mobilize process of democratic but democracy possessed resources that authoritarianism could not match. The voluntary cooperation of citizens who believed in their cause, the innovation that arose from decentralized decision, the resilience that Kamratriskanchunrum distributed rather than centralized production, and above all, the sheer productive capacity that free societies could generate when fully mobilized. The Liberty ships were not built by slave labor or conscripted workers, but by citizens who chose their participation, who worked long hours for wages in industries that had previously excluded them, who found meaning in contributing to a cause they understood as defending not just their nation but their way of life. The final Liberty ship, SS Albert M. Bow, was launched on October 30, 1945, 5 months after Germany's surrender and 7 weeks after Japan's capitulation. She was the 2,710th vessel of her class, the last product of a shipbuilding program that had constructed more tonnage in 4 years than all the world's shipyards had produced in the previous century. Her launch was barely noticed. The newsreels had moved on to covering demobilization and reconstruction, and Liberty ships had become so commonplace that their construction no longer qualified as news. Yet that very ordinariness represented the program's ultimate triumph. The vessels that had seemed impossibly ambitious in 1941, that German intelligence had dismissed as propaganda, that traditional shipbuilders had declared unworkable, had become so routine by 1945 that their production was unremarkable, expected, as ordinary as any other industrial product. The cost of the Liberty ship program was approximately $13 billion in 1940s dollars, representing roughly 2% of total American war expenditure. For that investment, America gained not just 2,710 ships, but the transformation of its maritime industrial base, the training of more than 1 million workers in advanced manufacturing skills, the development of construction techniques that would revolutionize post-war shipbuilding globally, and most importantly, the decisive advantage in the Atlantic that made every subsequent Allied operation possible. Without Liberty ships, there could have been no North African invasion in 1942. No Sicilian campaign in 1943, no D-Day in 1944. Every American soldier who fought in Europe crossed the Atlantic aboard vessels that existed only because American shipyards had achieved production rates that seemed fantastical to anyone thinking within traditional frameworks. The German U-boat service lost 783 submarines during the war, with approximately submariners killed out of 40,000 who casualty rate of 75% that made the U-boat force the deadliest service branch of any combatant nation. These men were not cowards or fanatics, but skilled professionals, who fought with courage and competence against increasingly impossible odds. Their defeat was not due to failure of nerve or lack of ability, but to strategic miscalculation at the highest levels of German planning, the assumption that Britain could be starved into submission. through submarine warfare had been reasonable in 1940, when British shipbuilding capacity was limited and American neutrality seemed permanent. It became untenable in 1942 when American industrial mobilization reached full intensity. By 1943 it was suicidal, sending young men to die in operations that could not achieve strategic objectives, regardless of tactical success. The U-boat commanders who survived the war carried with them the bitter knowledge that their courage had been spent in a campaign that was strategically bankrupt, that their losses had been meaningless, except as testament to the futility of fighting industrial wars against enemies with overwhelming material advantages. The statistical, final accounting of the Battle of the Atlantic reveals the scale of the German defeat with brutal clarity. Allied merchant ship losses totaled approximately 3,500 vessels and 14.5 million tons of shipping destroyed over the war's entire duration. American Liberty ship production alone replaced that entire lost tonnage with 2,710 vessels, totaling 19 million tons more ships than were sunk, launched faster than they could be destroyed, overwhelming the U-boat threat through industrial capacity that treated heavy losses as acceptable rather than catastrophic. When broader American shipbuilding is included, victory ships, tankers, specialized cargo vessels, escort carriers, destroyer escorts, the total American maritime production exceeds 55 million tons, roughly 4 times the total Allied losses. The mathematical imbalance was so extreme that the campaign's outcome was essentially determined by mid-1943, though the killing continued for 2 more years as Germany refused to acknowledge what the numbers made undeniable. The Liberty ship's influence extended into the Cold War era in unexpected ways. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, visiting an American factory in 1959, reportedly remarked that the Soviet Union's greatest mistake had been attempting to match American military production, weapon for weapon, rather than developing asymmetric capabilities that avoided direct industrial competition. The comment reflected painful lessons learned during the Second World War, when Soviet industrial production, despite heroic efforts and enormous human cost, never approached American levels. The Liberty ships had demonstrated that democratic capitalism, when fully mobilized, could generate productive capacity that command economies simply could not match. This recognition influenced Soviet strategic thinking throughout the Cold War, pushing Soviet military planning toward nuclear weapons and guerrilla warfare strategies that bypassed the industrial competition. They knew they could not win. For the American workers who built the Liberty ships, the post-war period brought both opportunity and disillusionment. The shipyards closed rapidly after 1945, and the employment that had seemed permanent during wartime evaporated within months as military contracts were cancelled and civilian shipping demand collapsed. Women who had worked as welders and crane operators were encouraged, sometimes forced to return to domestic roles, their industrial skills suddenly deemed unnecessary in peacetime. African American workers found that the employment opportunities that had opened during the war emergency closed again as white veterans returned and discriminatory hiring practices resumed. The unions that had organized shipyard workers during the war fought to preserve gains and benefits, with mixed success. Some workers transitioned to other industries, carrying their skills into construction, manufacturing, and other sectors. Others found themselves unemployed, their wartime contribution acknowledged rhetorically, but not rewarded materially. Yet the experience of building Liberty ships had transformed expectations in ways that could not be simply reversed once peace arrived. The women who had proven themselves capable of industrial work equal to men's would form the foundation of the feminist movement that emerged in the 1960s. The African American workers who had experienced integrated workplaces, however imperfect, would be less willing to accept segregation's indignities, contributing to the civil rights movement that would challenge Jim Crow laws throughout the South. The unions that had organized war workers would provide institutional support for progressive political movements throughout the post-war decades. The Liberty ships had required industrial mobilization, but that mobilization had social consequences that extended far beyond the immediate military purpose. The ships themselves, those that survived the war, had varied and often inglorious fates. Hundreds were laid up in reserve fleets, anchored in rivers and bays across America, their hulls painted with preservative, their machinery maintained in standby condition, ready for mobilization in future conflicts. Some were activated during the Korean War, proving that vessels built for one emergency could serve in another. Others deteriorated slowly, their hulls corroding, their machinery seizing, until they were finally sold for scrap, decades after their construction. A few found commercial service, purchased by shipping companies, and operated profitably for years, proving that emergency designs could occasionally achieve longevity. The SS John W. Brown and SS Jeremiah O'Brien survive today as museum ships, maintained by volunteers, opened to visitors who come to walk the decks and imagine what it meant to cross the Atlantic in such vessels when U-boats prowled beneath the waves. The technology that made the Liberty ships possible, prefabrication, mass production applied to shipbuilding, became so thoroughly integrated into post-war maritime construction that within a generation it was impossible to imagine building ships any other way. The revolution that Kaiser and others had pioneered became standard practice, incorporated into naval architecture, curricula, taught in trade schools, assumed as fundamental to modern shipbuilding. Young welders learning their trade in the 1960s or 1970s had no memory of the days when ships were riveted rather than welded, when construction required years rather than months, when shipbuilding was considered a craft that could not be matched. The Liberty ships had not just won a war, they had permanently transformed an entire industry, making traditional methods obsolete and forcing the entire global maritime sector to adopt American innovations or become uncompetitive. The philosophical lesson embedded in the Liberty ship story concerns the relationship between human agency and industrial capacity in determining historical outcomes. The great man theory of history, which attributes major events to the decisions and actions of exceptional individuals, seems inadequate when confronted with the reality of Liberty ship production. Certainly, individuals mattered. Roosevelt's decision to support Britain, Kaiser's innovative construction methods, Dinidas's strategic but the decisive factor was not individual genius or leadership, but systemic capacity. The accumulated industrial infrastructure, skilled workforce, organizational capability, and material resources that America possessed and could mobilize when circumstances demanded. The Liberty ships proved that in modern industrial warfare, systemic advantages overwhelm individual brilliance, that material abundance defeats tactical excellence, that the boring details of production schedules and supply chains matter more than the dramatic narratives of battlefield heroism. This is not to diminish the courage of those who fought or the skill of those who commanded, but to recognize that courage and skill, however admirable, cannot overcome mathematical realities when the imbalance becomes sufficiently extreme. The U-boat commanders who stalked convoys across the Atlantic were among the most skilled naval warriors of their generation, operating their vessels with competence that matched or exceeded their Allied counterparts. Their defeat was not due to inferior seamanship, but to a strategic environment where superior seamanship was irrelevant, because the enemy could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. The Liberty ships rendered tactical excellence strategically meaningless, proving that in wars of attrition between industrial powers, productive capacity ultimately determines outcomes, regardless of battlefield performance. The ethical dimensions of the Liberty ship story remain complex and contested. The vessels were instruments of war, built to carry the materials that enabled Allied military operations, including the bombing campaigns that destroyed German and Japanese cities and killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They transported the fuel for tanks, the ammunition for artillery, the bombs for aircraft, enabling violence on unprecedented scale. Yet they also carried food that prevented starvation in Britain, medical supplies that saved lives, equipment that rebuilt infrastructure. The same industrial capacity that created weapons of destruction created the tools of reconstruction. The Liberty ships embodied this duality, neither purely destructive nor purely beneficent, but simply instrumentals whose moral character derived from their use rather than their nature. The final vessel of the Liberty ship program, that SS Albert M. Bow, launched in October 1945, sailed for only a few years before being laid up in reserve. Her career was unremarkable, her service unmemorable, her fate prosaic. She was sold for scrap in 1971, cut apart in a Pakistani shipbreaking yard, her steel recycled into other products, her identity erased. Yet in her anonymity lay the program's deepest meaning. She was never meant to be memorable, never designed to last, never intended as anything except an emergency measure to meet an immediate need. that she and her 2,709 sisters succeeded beyond all expectation or design, proved not their exceptional qualities but the power of adequate solutions produced at revolutionary scale. The Liberty ships were not sublime, they were sufficient, and sufficiency, multiplied by thousands, proved more decisive than any amount of excellence. The echo of welding torches has faded from American shipyards, most of which closed decades ago, their slipways empty, their workers dispersed, their machinery scrapped or mothballed. The industrial capacity that built Liberty ships migrated overseas, to South Korea and China and other nations that now dominate global shipbuilding. Yet the principles pioneered in those wartime yards, prefabrication, mass production, systematic training of semi-skilled workers, just-in-time delivery of components, continue to shape manufacturing worldwide. Every modern factory owes something to the innovations developed under pressure of wartime urgency, when traditional methods were abandoned and new approaches were invented by necessity rather than theory. What the Germans never expected was not merely that American shipyards would build vessels quickly, but that American democracy would prove more efficient at mobilizing industrial capacity than German authoritarianism. The Nazi ideology that glorified the Führer principle, that assumed centralized control was superior to democratic debate, that believed orders and obedience would outperform negotiation and cooperation, confronted in the Liberty ships evidence of its fundamental error. Free workers building ships they chose to build proved more productive than any coerced labor system. Democratic institutions making decisions through messy political processes proved more effective than authoritarian commands. Capitalism's profit motive and market mechanisms proved superior to state planning in organizing complex industrial production. The Liberty ships were not just vessels but refutations, physical evidence that democracy's apparent inefficiency concealed strengths that authoritarianism could neither match nor understand. In the final reckoning, the Battle of the Atlantic was decided not in the darkness beneath the waves, where U-boats prowled and convoys scattered, but in the bright daylight of American shipyards, where welders worked and cranes lifted and vessels slid down slipways into harbors that no enemy threatened. The decisive battles were not fought with torpedoes and depth charges, but with production schedules and delivery deadlines and quality control procedures. The heroes were not exclusively the sailors who faced death at sea, but also the workers who built the ships that made those voyages possible, the engineers who designed the production systems, the managers who organized the supply chains, the thousands of anonymous contributors whose collective effort created the industrial abundance that drowned German strategic planning in an ocean of American productivity. The Liberty ships sailed into history carrying cargo, but their true burden was the future itself, post-war world, shaped by the recognition that industrial capacity, properly mobilized, could overwhelm military excellence, that democratic societies possessed reserves of strength that authoritarian regimes could not access, that freedom's messy inefficiency concealed efficiencies that tyranny's apparent order could never achieve. They proved that abundance was not merely wealth but weapon, that production was not merely economic but strategic, that the capacity to build determined the capacity to prevail in conflicts where endurance mattered more than brilliance. The ships themselves are mostly gone now, scrapped or sunk or preserved as relics. But their legacy endures in every modern factory, every mass-produced product, every system that values adequacy over excellence. When adequacy can be produced at scale sufficient to overwhelm all opposition, the ocean is empty of Liberty ships now. Those waters that once carried thousands of them across the Atlantic in convoys that stretched from horizon to horizon. But their absence is more eloquent than their presence ever was, for they were never meant to last but only to serve, never designed as monuments but as tools, never intended to be remembered individually but to succeed collectively. In their anonymous multitude lay their triumph, in their crude simplicity lay their genius, in their sheer overwhelming numbers lay the answer to every calculation the Germans had made about tonnage and attrition and the mathematics of starvation. The U-boats could not sink ships faster than America could build them. That simple truth, emerging slowly from wartime fog, determined everything else that followed. The Liberty ships were democracy's answer to tyranny, abundance's response to attrition, the industrial future's verdict on military tradition. They were never beautiful, but they were decisive. They were never elegant, but they were enough. And enough, in total war, meant everything.